Welcome back. I hope everybody had a good break. We're going to introduce our next speaker. Very excited to have, oh, I'm sorry. I want to just say that Tom Peace has just added to the chat the link to the petition that Lynn Jackson was referring to. So if you want to see the link to that petition, please check the comments in the chat. So our next speaker is Cheryl Thompson. Dr. Cheryl Thompson is an assistant professor at Ryerson University in the School of Creative Industries. She is author of Beauty in a Box, Detangling the Roots of Canada's Black Beauty Culture. She previously held a Banting postdoctoral fellowship at the University of Toronto. Dr. Thompson's essays have appeared in Emergent Feminisms, Challenging a Post-Feminist Media Culture, the Journal of Canadian Studies, Canadian Journal of History, and Feminist Media Studies. She has also published articles in The Conversation, Toronto Star, Montreal Gazette, Spacing, Horizons Magazine, Halifax Coast, and Rabble.ca. She grew up in Scarborough and currently resides in Toronto. Please welcome Dr. Cheryl Thompson.
Yes, hi everyone. Everyone hear me? Okay.
Yes.
And you know what, before I start, I just want to say, Lynn, believe me, everyone who's an academic on this, we feel you, because that has happened to me in front of a classroom of students who are not so friendly. So don't even worry about it. These things happen. And now, as I say that, let me see if I'm going to stumble and have the same problem. Let's hope not. I have it all queued up, so it should be fine. Yes? All good?
Yes.
Excellent. Okay, hi everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for this. And I'm actually really excited to be here. I mean, you know, I was actually supposed to be like everyone else here in person. And it would have been the first time that I ever attended the Buxton History and Genealogy conference. So that was a bit upsetting, but I have been to Buxton before. So that helps. Just a little bit about my background. So I am, as Irene said, I am born and raised in Scarborough, but I now live in Toronto proper. My parents come from Jamaica. And so I have that Caribbean background, but I have, for the last 10 years in writing what is you see on the screen now, my first book, sort of invested myself in knowing about Black people in Canada, and specifically knowing more about what I like to call the African Ontario experience, because that's not an experience that I know as someone who has Caribbean lineage. And so what I've put together today is sort of things that have come out of me writing this book, and things that speak specifically to the region from Windsor to London, Ontario, going back to the late 19th to the early 20th century. And at the same time, I'm one of those, you know, there's some historians on here and they always laugh when I say this, but I don't consider myself a historian, because I always like to take history in the past and then show you the present. So in my presentation, there's going to be moments where I'm talking about something historically, and then I'm going to show you like the actual place that it is today through like Google Maps. And I think for everyone on here, Canadians, Americans, it really doesn't matter. A lot of the history that I'm going to talk about, there's just so much more that could be said. Honestly, I am literally the tip of the iceberg, but you know, every iceberg has a tip, so we got to start somewhere. So what I first want to do is situate that a lot of the things I'm going to be talking about are also coming out of this particular newspaper and others that has sort of come up in my research. And so what I'm doing in the talk is like I'm trying to take the things that I found in the newspaper to actually talk about Black entrepreneurship. And I think that's a topic that we don't hear a lot in the context of Canada, and especially Ontario. And there's a history of Black entrepreneurship in the province. And so I'm going to go through the newspaper and talk about, again, as you see in the slide, I was saying Black communities in southwestern Ontario, such as Buxton, Chatham, Dresden. There were large concentrations of Black populations, as we all know, that settled around these years. And then, but at the same time, they remained then and somewhat in the present distinct communities with their own histories. and I would say relatively autonomous. And I think that's what's so fascinating to me, of how these communities have basically managed to maintain their identities and their cultural heritage amidst the big bad cities that are, you know, London and Toronto and everywhere else. That has always been something that I've just always found so amazing, and something that I've wanted to know more about. And so part of my presentation is really trying to get at how Black people used self-care, how they self-sustained, and then how they self-represented, again, in this like late 19th century, early 20th century time period. And I think that's also a time period that in just the annals of Canadian history has tended to be ignored, marginalized, and removed, that we don't hear about it, we don't know anything about it. So I hope in the short time that I have, that I give you all just a little nugget of some of that. And so I want to start with a little brief history of barbering, because what most people don't know is that barbering is really one of the first outlets for especially African-American men, not just in the post-antebellum period, but also during slavery as well. And so at the same time, what you have with this practice of barbering is that Black women were kind of left out of it, because the 19th century, you know, we talk about sexism today, we can't even imagine the sexism of the 19th century. So you really had the intersections of sexism and racism that prevented Black women in the 19th century from really being successful at hair care. It's not until after, when you get into the late 19th and the early 20th century, that you have this idea of not just doing hair, but it actually being something that can now be a business. And you know, as everyone in this room probably knows, barbering, just like the hair salon, become the cornerstone of Black communities in Canada and the US. And so what you have here is an example of the photo on your left is from the Toronto City Archives, and you have these two individuals who, it's funny because this photograph is in a city archive, but they don't have any details about it. You know, unless you are connected to Charles Duval and Fred Bolin, and you know genealogically who these people are, you really don't know their story. And I can tell you, if they're running a barbershop in Toronto in 1895, they probably didn't open that barbershop in 1894. It was probably there for a while. And so there's a lot of details that are missing when we don't, you know, when we put up photographs of them, we don't give details about who the people are. But at the same time, what I want you to think about is this ad here that I plucked from The Dawn of Tomorrow, which was the newspaper that I showed in the previous slide, and what it actually says in the ad itself. It says a 3-chair barber business for sale. 50 years practice in the same building. And this ad is from 1925. So that means this business was opened in 1875. And then it says excellent locality, good line of customers. I just think there's so much richness in that, even though we don't have the details about what the business was actually like. And I tried to find some information about this particular address, and I found it really interesting. 95 Glenwood Avenue in London, Ontario today is a subdivision. It's a housing division with houses. So there's no remnants of this business in that community. And most people, there's actually a house at 95 Glenwood Avenue. They probably have no idea that, you know, 100 years ago, somebody had a business, a Black-owned barber was at that same location. And so here, what we have is another example that I want to take you to. And here I'm taking this from the Canadian Observer. So the Canadian Observer was a newspaper that was established from 1914 to 1919. And the purpose of this newspaper, like its intention, was to raise funds, awareness, and pressure the government to allow Black men to enlist in World War I. So that was the purpose of the newspaper, right? And historically, what happened? Because of that newspaper, and there was another newspaper out in Nova Scotia, I believe it was called the Atlantic Advocate, that also did the same thing. You had the creation of Canada's first, and I don't think only, but it's the first segregated battalion, the number 2 construction battalion. But in the pages of this newspaper, you also see Black culture. You also see Black entrepreneurship, and they have ads in this newspaper that is supporting Black business. So here's an ad here from, oop, 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 sensitive keyboard. Here's an ad here that's the Bradford House, Mrs. J.W. Bradford, proprietor, 184 King Street West, Chatham, Ontario. So in the Canadian Observer, they would also list hotels where Black people could stay. So this is basically our example of a Canadian Green Book, because it lists all the places that are welcoming to Black service, to Black clientele. And so I was very fascinated. 184 King Street West, like Chatham, what is that today? So here you see a map, present location. If any of you know Chatham, you have probably seen this particular place. So this is where that hotel would have stood in 1915. And I think why I love to show the juxtaposition is to think about, what do those spaces register today as it relates to Black community? Do they still register as Black spaces when a century ago they would have been Black spaces? And so what has changed in between? And is there still any remnants of the Bradford House anywhere? Probably not, right? And I think that absence is kind of what I'm trying to kind of convey in my presentation, to think about what do we do with Black absences in as much as we pay attention to Black presences. And so here's another example of an ad from that same newspaper from September 16th, 1916. And this is for a hair care product. And so I just plucked exactly what the ad said. It says an excellent hair dressing, producing a healthy, luxurious growth of hair, stops falling hair, positively eradicates dandruff, and gives that brilliant natural color to gray or faded hair. Real hair grower should be used twice a week, rubbing it on the scalp. If hair is dry and harsh, use as described. And then it says, Mrs. Geo Green, Windsor agent, real hair grower. And so Mrs. Geo Green was based out of Windsor, Ontario in 1916, but she was an agent for a company that was actually based out of Denver, Colorado at that time. And so this product, the real hair grower, was being made out of Denver, and then she was selling it in the Canadian marketplace in Windsor to those probably in the Windsor community, and maybe even Detroit, since it's right across the border. But what's interesting is that the Mrs. Green was located at 214 Goyo Street. I can never pronounce it. I don't even know if I'm saying it right. Apologies to all Windsorites. Irene, you can correct.
Goyo. The problem is that we don't pronounce anything correctly in French here, so I know it's very confusing, but it's Goyo.
Yes, it is. Thank you so much. But here's that same address today. This is where Mrs. Green was selling her products out of her home. And I just took a step back when I did the Google map, and I was like, I have to show the actual picture for those who don't know Windsor, because today that's the Windsor Police Headquarters. Okay. And down Goyo Street, that's Detroit. And so again, thinking about absences, you know, we're going back a century. Someone at this location was selling products. A Black woman was basically a sole proprietor. Today, that is an agent of the state. And so one of the things that I hope in doing all this that I get people to kind of think about is where do Black people go? Like, where do those histories go? And how do they get replaced with something else that is something that I would not necessarily consider to be pro-Black, right? And you know, that's just an interesting juxtaposition to me. And so in thinking about that and thinking about what I just talked about, I now want to kind of transition into the second part where we actually talk about the people, like people on the ground who were doing the work of not just Black entrepreneurship, but also Black hair care and beauty. And so, of course, everyone knows Madam C.J. Walker, right? And this Netflix film that just came out in 2020, starring Octavia Spencer. And what people, you know, I kind of watched a bit of the film, but then I was like, oh, I can't watch this. It's too revisionist. They just left a lot of little things out of the film, such as the fact that Madam C.J. Walker, someone of her magnitude, the first millionaire ever in the world, they don't just exist in a vacuum, and they often learn a lot of their techniques and a lot of what they learned from other Black people. In this particular case, Annie Turnbull Malone was really I would say her mentor. She is the one before Madam C.J. Walker who started her own product line, who showed Madam C.J. Walker how to go door to door, selling throughout the South, right? Doing the quote unquote Chitlin circuit throughout the South to go door to door to sell to Black women, to bring Black women into the salon and show them the techniques of hair care. And what's really important is that at the turn of the 20th century, one of the issues that Black women and men suffered from was actually malnutrition. It was a dietary issue that was showing itself in the scalp. So a lot of hair care products were trying to fix things that were actually related to health. They weren't just related to dandruff and your hair falling out. There was ill health. And so, you know, that wasn't really known at the time. But so what were they doing in those products is that they were using household products and things that they had around the house to make hair care products for people to literally improve their self-esteem, not just so they can have a nice hairdo. And I think it's hard for us in the present day to really understand the extent to which the mental weight of enslavement, even post Reconstruction, was that Black people lived in an environment where everywhere they turned, they were not nourished and seen and heard. And I think what a juxtaposition 2020. I mean, show of hands, I can't see your hands, but are we not still living in an environment where we are not seen and heard and nourished in so many ways? And I think, you know, maybe we can talk about that in the chat about how we get over the hump, because we're still in many ways dealing with early 20th century, late 19th century issues. But that being said, what I want to show you is an ad from Madam C.J. Walker. And what's really important in this ad, you can even see some of the things that she's pointing to. In today, you would probably recognize that there were health issues and there's a failure of health that's really going on here, and the lack of attentiveness. If any of you have read anything from W.E.B. Du Bois, you know, The Souls of Black Folks, one of the things that he talks about specifically is in the Reconstruction era and afterward, just the lack of attention that's being paid and well-being. And so let's move on, because I'm very mindful of also time. I still want to keep on the same time, because in Canada we have Viola Desmond. And you know, Viola Desmond has often been taken up in recent years as the Rosa Parks, Canada's Rosa Parks. And for her action in the Roselawn Theatre in New Glasgow, Nova Scotia, when she refused to sit in the segregated seating, and she was arrested and fined and jailed and all the bit. But what I want us to do is step back and realize that Viola Desmond is Canada's Madam C.J. Walker. She was an entrepreneur first and foremost. The main reason she was in New Glasgow, Nova Scotia on that day is just like Madam C.J. Walker had done. She was selling her products door to door. She was in her car trying to reach the outskirts beyond Halifax into Nova Scotia, and then her car broke down, and that's how she got embroiled in the situation. But Viola Desmond, as you see here by these pictures, she had her own studio. She actually had to go to the United States and get trained. She also got trained in Montreal because Halifax was a segregated city, and they practiced a de facto Jim Crow, and they would not allow Black women and men to be trained in hair care. So they had to go elsewhere. And then she came back, she opened her business, and she also opened her own beauty school where she was training Black women on all the techniques that she had learned in the US and elsewhere. And so I think why I bring this up, it's to really think about the extent to which Black women and men in the past have built things for themselves, have been quote unquote self-sufficient. But at the same time, because they lack the structural support, that over time, they can't sustain it. So part of my discussion is also to think about Black sustainability. And I think in the 21st century, we're still asking those same questions. How can we get to a Black sustainability across the board, right? In many different areas.
So we'll come back to that. But what I want to talk about now is just some evidences, I guess, from the actual newspaper that I have of Black women who were sole proprietors, who were beauty entrepreneurs. And so excuse the grainiality of the images. They're being plucked from, again, like a turn of the 20th century newspaper. And I have all the citations there to let you know where I got them from. But these two women, and you'll probably recognize some of these names because they are obviously names that are connected to lineages in Southwestern Ontario. And so in these examples that I'm giving, these are women who, and the wording that I have under the image, it's plucked exactly as it was in the newspaper. Ethel Shreve, teacher of shorthand and typewriting in the Wilberforce Institute, Chatham, Ontario. She is a graduate of the Chatham Business College. This is 1923. Then we have Madam Barry Hunter of London, Ontario, graduate of the State Normal Teachers Institute of Frankfort, Kentucky. At present, she is directing the Hill Street Baptist Church. And one thing I will say is that Black newspapers at this time, even in the US, so what we would call the Negro press, they celebrated Black excellence at every opportunity. They would put a picture in the newspaper, they would tell you who the person was, what they're doing, and then they would also tell you sort of their educational attainment. And so you had this sort of example. And if any of you know early 20th century, late 19th century history, this is sort of the era of what they would call the new Negro, and this idea of crafting a new identity and a new beingness in this new century where Black people were finally, first century in the quote unquote modern era where Black people were not held in bondage. Although we know through systems of Jim Crow and convict leasing and redlining that there were other forms of institutional domination that was enacted on the Black body, but it was the first century where Black people had a sense of autonomy, that they could still do what it is that they wanted to do. And so I have a picture here of the Wilberforce Institute that, and this is from I believe on the website, this is from 1993. I'm not sure if it's still there. Maybe somebody in the chat could say if they know if it's still there, but nonetheless, this was a real building, and you could see, in this archival photo, people just have their bikes chained up against a fence. Like, who knows if the children who are playing out here have a connection to this building, because it looks like it's been boarded up by this time. And again, I think it's really important that we start to make those real connections between place, space, and history, so that our young people kind of know the spaces and places that they're playing in today. And so here's another example. And so this is an example of, and so I'm using this term beauty culturalist. So a beauty culturalist is a woman who, at the turn of the 20th century, they would have called them beauty culturalists. These were women who developed systems and methods and signature skin and hair care programs and defined distribution networks. That's what they were called. So Madam C.J. Walker was a beauty culturalist. In Canada, we have similar beauty culturalists, and this is one of them, Lillian D. Wells, who's also connected to the other, if I go back so I don't forget her name, Madam Barry Hunter Wells. They had a business, right, where again, out of London, Ontario, they were selling hair straightener and hair grower products. And from today's point of view, we say, why were Black women straightening their hair? They should have loved who they were, and that's the rhetoric. However, we have to again put things into time and place and context. At the turn of the 20th century, end of the 19th, 20th century, part of the uplift, the racial uplift of Black people, was to kind of remove the quote unquote stain of enslavement. And part of the stain of enslavement was the lack of ability to self-care, the lack of ability to adorn aesthetics of beauty. And so, yeah, we can debate, why they chose the straightened aesthetic as this pillar of beauty, but nonetheless, that's what the sentiment behind it was. And so you have a lot of these women, mostly women, Black women, who are creating products and selling them out of their homes. This particular location, however, in London, Ontario, I could not find. So I don't know where that is today, if it still exists or not. But what's most important to know is that these Black women had a dressing parlor and they were selling products in 1920s London, Ontario. I mean, I think that headline alone is worthy of remembrance. And so what I want to do in the last few minutes that I have is just quickly talk a little bit about late 19th century, early 20th century fashion. Okay, I'm not a fashion scholar, but I'm an interdisciplinary scholar. So I dip into the literature just to make sense and to give context. So everything I just said to you, everything that's, and you know, it's interesting because this 2020 marks 100 years of women's suffrage. And if any of you have been watching, there's a lot of remembrance of women's suffrage. And so part of women's suffrage was also about dress reform and the changing of women's aesthetics. And so in the late 19th century, you had this hairstyle that started to become extremely popular. And so this hairstyle, the Gibson girl hairstyle, was made popular by Charles Dana Gibson. And this hairstyle was essentially almost like a pompadour. They would comb the hair upwards in the central part and leave some hair falling. And then there would be like a bun or something at the top. And then to the right, you have a fashion print from the Delineator. This is a 19th century women's magazine. And you have an example of what we would call the leg of mutton sleeve. And this sleeve still exists. Some of you might have some blouses in your closet with this same sleeve. It's probably not as embellished as this, but the leg of mutton sleeve is still a popular pattern in clothing for women. And in the 1990s, I think 1980s and 90s, men would wear it too. So this pattern was really at its height in the 1890s. And same with the Gibson girl. The Gibson girl hairdo is really at its height in the 1890s and the first 2 decades of the 20th century. By the time you get into the 1920s, you have the bob and other types of hairstyles that kind of replace the Gibson girl. And why am I talking about all this? I'm talking about all of this because in the first page of my slides, if anybody noticed, I had a photograph of 2 Black women. And now, before I end, I'm going to go back to those 2 Black women. So Martha and Maria Black from Buxton. First of all, how did I get this image? How did I get this image? Well, here's a little story that I want to share with you. In 2012, when I was doing my dissertation at McGill University, the dissertation is what ended up being the book. I contacted Shannon Prince. I don't think Shannon's here today, but I know Brian is. And Brian, I know you. We've met many, many times. But I contacted Shannon and I was like, Shannon, you know, I'm doing this work. And I just want to know if you have any images of Black women in the late 19th, early 20th century in southwestern Ontario that sort of capture a particular aesthetic that you would consider to be a beautiful aesthetic. And if you know Shannon, you know exactly what happened. She didn't know me. Well, no, I think Shannon, we had met once, but she really didn't know me. Anyway, she replied and she said, just let me know how I can help you and what you need. And so Shannon sent me a bunch of images. This was one of them. And so in sending me the images, what I love about Shannon is that she gave me context. She told me who they were. And so she informed me that Martha and Maria Black were daughters of Julia and Horace Black. After Martha was married, she remained in the Elgin settlement at Buxton, where she and her husband farmed and raised several children. Maria returned to Kentucky with her husband. So what you're looking at here is a family photo. And what you're also looking at is the Gibson girl hairstyle and the leg of mutton sleeve. And in this image. And why I'm showing you this is to, you know, we often don't implicate Black people in fashion aesthetics of the past, like in the 19th century. Right? We kind of think, okay, Harlem Renaissance and beyond, it starts. But the reality is that even in the Reconstruction, post-Reconstruction, Black people were creating their own dress, their own style. Yes, it was in conversation with the dominant culture style. And what typically happened around this time is that women probably bought dress patterns and had them made women's magazines were always including dress patterns that people could sort of mimic the style of the day. And I just love this image because it shows you that these Black women are fashionable. These Black women are not antiquated. These Black women know exactly, you could even see in Martha Black's face is a little smirk, like, I know I'm looking good. So take this picture because I've been standing for 4 hours kind of thing, because pictures took a long time to get an exposure back then. But that's all to say is that by the turn of the 20th century, Black people started to take their own family photos for the first time. And the new Negro woman, which I think is really captured in this photograph, while much smaller in numbers, right, as compared to the United States, just on a population size, we don't have the same numbers, but it doesn't mean that we were not implicated in the same conversations and the same practices. And I think that's what's really important to remember. And so this is the moment where Black people begin to use photography to redefine themselves. And I know all of us have images, family photos that tell us so much without us even having to know who those people are. It's like we look at the images and we know who they are, even though we didn't live through their time. So that is all to say that there's such a rich history of Black entrepreneurship and Black culture in Southwestern Ontario that is yet to be discovered and shared. And I just hope that in the short time that I've spent with you, I've kind of given you some glimpse into that, and maybe I've sparked some of you to also go on your own journey to tell the stories that still need to be told. Thank you. And I have another book coming out in February of 2021 that tells the story of Uncle Tom from the novel right through till the present day. So I hope that many of you will look out for that one. And yeah, thank you so much.
Wonderful. I know a lot of people in these parts, Southwestern Ontario, will be very interested in that book. There are lots of Henson descendants around. So we do have some questions. Let's see. Debbie Grimm is asking whether you know anything about Eliza Potter.
Eliza Potter. The name is vaguely familiar, but not off the top of my head.
So hopefully in the comments, Debbie, you can tell us anything that you know about Eliza Potter. That would be great.
You do.
We have lots of compliments and people telling you it's a great presentation. That's to be expected. Adrienne Shad has mentioned that in her book, really great book, Journey from Tollgate to Parkway, African Canadians in Hamilton, she discovered that most of the barbers in Hamilton were Black and that many Black barbers engaged in the, quote, white trade, end quote. Did you come across this in your research?
Yes, Adrienne Shad, I've read your book, and thank you. It was so informative to me when I was doing my dissertation. And yes, one of the things we have to remember is that, what came out of enslavement is that Black men in particular took African knowledge and European tools, and they learned how to cut hair. So even during enslavement, Black men, this is never shown in any of those slave movies that they like to produce. Black men often were called upon to cut the hair of their masters on the plantation. So they had those skills. And yes, I have come across ads in the Toronto Star, like in the back then it was the Toronto Daily News, or it actually might have been the Globe. Sorry, it was the Globe, where you see advertising of that. It's kind of hinting that if you have the skills to cut, quote unquote, European hair, your services are desired. So white men often lacked the ability to cut their own hair, so they would ask Black men to do it, and Black men knew how to do it.
Very interesting. Adrienne has also asked a follow-up question. The photo of Charles Duval and Fred Bolin, she had assumed that the barbershop was in Collingwood, but you're saying the photo shows that the shop was in Toronto. Do you know where it was located?
Well, this is it. I mean, again, even I could be incorrect, but it's in a City of Toronto archive. So I have to assume if it was not in Toronto, that they should note that it's not, but they don't. So this is also part of the general inability or difficulties of us really being able to pinpoint and lock down Black presence in the past. Who knows? Like, honestly, I put that up there, but I can't even say with certainty because there's no biographical information for Charles Duval or Brolin, right? I just don't know.
Yes. So somebody is asking a great question, which I also echo. Brenda Travis, cousin of many of us, is saying that she has more pictures of the Black family, and so do a bunch of us. I mean, there are lots of photos around of 19th century Black women in the Canadian context showing off their beautiful fashions and their hairstyles, and often being photographed with books and other symbols of their status. Are you still interested in those? Are you still working on this kind of research, or have you kind of moved on?
I'm like, yes, yes, and yes. That is like, when I hear those stories, I'm like, that is gold. And so the question, however, is, I'm very mindful of, especially Black people giving up their personal narrative and not knowing, what are you going to do with this? Because we have a long history of that happening to us, right? So I'm still doing this work. If you have images and you want to send me and you want me to like tell you what's going on in the image, I would gladly do that for you as to my best of my abilities. And if I can't do it, I'll refer you to maybe some other people who could, but I am always doing the work. Even though I do have other projects, to me, this work is kind of, I call it ancestor work. It doesn't ever really leave you. It's always in the background.
It's ancestor work, but it's also very beautiful and aesthetically pleasing. And it's vintage Black glamour work too. And that's a great thing.
Yeah, you know what, just quickly, there was actually something on Facebook, I don't know when it was, where they took all these old 19th century photographs and they turned them into color. So they were all black and whites, and they kind of just colorized them so you could see exactly what those people would have looked like in the moment. I mean, it was breathtaking. I just can't remember what it was now, but I know it circulated on Facebook.
Yes, that's wonderful work. And it often is so popular too. People just love to see those images because they are so contrary to the expectations of how our people looked in those days.
Okay.
Tennille Warren is saying it's an amazing presentation, but also asking whether you have found anything pertaining to the Queensbush Waterloo region.
Queensbush Waterloo region, that's more tricky. I'm still, in those areas, actually, I still have so many things that I've collected that speak to not necessarily Black beauty entrepreneurship, but speak to specific people in those parts posting ads for Black servants. Like, I'm talking about in like the 1920s and 30s. And so I have some evidences of those kinds of material traces, but I don't really have a lot in terms of entrepreneurship. But again, what I always say to people is it doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. And often, if you're living in those communities, you should go into the local library and see what they have in their archival records, because often they're not cataloged and they're not cross-referenced. So me in Toronto, I would never even know of their existence.
Okay, please check out the chat, everyone. Adam Aronson has posted a great link about colorizing photographs, a free resource that helps you colorize Black and white photos, apparently. So that's very exciting. Debbie Grimm has provided a follow-up to her question about Eliza Potter. So this is what she's written. I'm quite fascinated. She wrote a book in 1859 about her experiences as a hairdresser in the South and up to Canada. She studied in France. She's going to, she's added her novel. It's Hairdressers, EXPE00pot.pdf. You can see it in the chat.
Oh, okay.
She says, my association with her is that she would often teach up and coming young Black women about hairdressing. I believe she taught two of my ancestors, Jenny and Mariah Brooks. The reason why I believe that is I have in my possession a coffee tankard, which is so beautiful and was given to Eliza Potter, hairdresser from the Ladies of Toronto. I think one of my ancestors was given this by Eliza. Wow, Debbie, that's amazing.
Yeah.
Thomas Peace has posted the full link, which is in archive.org. So check that out, everybody. Cheryl Thompson, this was an awesome presentation. Thank you so much for being with us today.
No, thank you for having me. And what I will say to everyone is, remember, as I mentioned throughout, I just gave a slice of the story. You know, there's so much more to the story. So, you know, being able to maybe ignite people to tell more of those stories, I think it's a great opportunity. So thanks for having me.
Absolutely, our pleasure. And if you want to know more, you have to get that book. So
That's right. Get that book.
please get the book. All right, we're going to go to a break now. And when we come back, we will have an opportunity to hear briefly from Brian and Shannon Prince and from our final speaker of the day, Gail George. So enjoy the break.